Eddie stood on the edge of the shore, his eyes scanning the endless ocean that trapped him. He clutched the tattered duffel bag they'd dropped with him. A knife, a fishing line, and a canteen. 6 months, they said. 6 months to change everything. 6 months on this isolated island instead of spending the next 15 years rotting in a cell for armed robbery. He wanted to laugh. What was this place supposed to do that prison couldn't? The first few days were a blur of hunger and anger. Eddie drank rainwater he collected in hollowed-out leaves and ate raw coconuts until his stomach cramped. At night, the cold wind cut through his thin clothes, and the sound of animals rustling in the brush kept him wide-eyed until sunrise. He was alone, scared and growing desperate. On the 4th morning, Eddie woke to find a man sitting calmly by his pathetic excuse for a campfire. "Name's Henry," the man said, as if they'd just met at a diner. He was older, with calloused hands and a warm smile. "Looks like you could use some help." Eddie didn't ask where Henry came from. He didn't ask how Henry knew he was there, or why he wasn't afraid. Something about the man's steady presence made Eddie feel less alone. Over the next week, Henry taught Eddie the basics. They built a sturdy shelter together using bamboo and palm leaves. Henry showed him how to weave traps for crabs and where to find fish in the shallows. He taught Eddie how to light a fire using only sticks and patience. By the end of the week, Eddie was eating cooked fish instead of raw coconuts, and his shelter kept out the wind. Henry left without warning one night, and though Eddie searched for him the next morning, there was no trace of the man. Eddie couldn't tell if Henry had been real or a figment of his imagination brought on by hunger and exhaustion. But the shelter and fire pit were real, and for the first time, Eddie felt a glimmer of hope. A week later, another visitor appeared. This one was a woman named Elena. She was younger, with an easy laugh and sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything. "You've got the basics down," Elena said as she studied his camp. "But surviving isn't just about food and shelter. You need to understand the land if you're going to thrive." Elena showed Eddie which plants were edible and which were poisonous. She taught him to read the weather by the way the clouds moved and how to find freshwater streams by following animal tracks. Eddie learned quickly. He discovered a rhythm to the island, a natural order he'd never noticed before. It wasn't just surviving anymore, it was living. But just like Henry, Elena disappeared after a week, leaving Eddie alone again. Weeks passed, and Eddie grew stronger. His hands were scarred and calloused, his body leaner and more resilient. He built tools, crafted a better shelter, and even began to enjoy the challenge of each new day. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It wasn't until the 3rd visitor arrived that Eddie understood what it was. The man introduced himself as Marcus. He was tall and quiet, with a piercing gaze that seemed to look straight through Eddie. "You've done well," Marcus said, sitting down by the fire Eddie had learned to master. "But surviving out here isn't the real test. The real test is up here." He tapped his temple. Over the next week, Marcus forced Eddie to confront himself. They talked about the armed robbery, about the choices Eddie had made and the people he had hurt. Marcus didn't judge or preach. He listened, and his questions forced Eddie to dig deeper than he ever had before. "What do you want to do with the rest of your life?" Marcus asked one evening. Eddie stared at the fire for a long time before answering. "I don't know, but I don't want to be that guy anymore." Marcus smiled. "That's a start." When Marcus left, Eddie didn't feel the same sense of loss he had before. Instead, he felt ready. By the time 6 months were up, Eddie had built more than just a life on the island. He had built a new version of himself. When the boat arrived to take him back to the mainland, Eddie didn't look back at the island with relief. He looked back with gratitude. As the mainland came into view, Eddie wondered about Henry, Elena, and Marcus. Were they real, or had he imagined them? He would never know for sure, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that they, or something, had given him the tools to survive, to grow, and to change. And for the first time in a long time, Eddie believed he could make it.